Welcome to the Spy Collection Digital Edition, where we are looking at spy artifacts that only exist in digital format. I'm Anastasios, and today's artifact comes from the period of 2014-2016, when Russia's military intelligence had some of its busiest times conducting dozens and dozens of cyber espionage operations every month. For that reason, this part 1 will be going through a handful of those cyber espionage operations. If you're interested in more, please let us know and we can proceed with more parts dissecting other operations of that era. The period of 2014-2016 was a very tense time for Russia's foreign relations and military operations. Just to name a few, the conflict in Crimea was at its peak with direct and indirect involvement from NATO forces. The NATO Wales Summit of 2015 resulted in several NATO Special Operations Forces deployed as a high readiness joint task force in the eastern part of NATO countries, literally next to the Russian borders. In late 2014, President of Russia Vladimir Putin announced a new military doctrine which listed NATO's military build-up near the Russian borders as the top national military threat. Later on, the nuclear arsenal discussion started again. The conflict in Syria was also peaking, and Turkey, a NATO member, shot down a Russian fighter jet. Then the upcoming 2016 US elections were approaching. The gas pipeline/energy issues in Europe, with Russia playing a key role, and many other developments. For instance, as we can find in this United States Army War College press publication from 2015, titled The New Russian Engagement with Latin America, Strategic Position, Commerce and Dreams of the Past, where it says the following about Chile. 2 months after Bachelet's March 2014 inauguration, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov made an official visit to Chile. 6 months later, President Bachelet met with Putin on the sidelines of the APEC Leaders Summit in Beijing, in a dialogue that Putin subsequently described as intense. The Bachelet-Putin meeting also produced a commitment for the Chilean Foreign Minister Geraldo Muñoz to travel to Russia to follow up on issues raised by the presidential discourse. Moreover, Bachelet has also reportedly invited Putin to visit Chile. And for Mexico, we have. In 2013, Mexico was Russia's 6th largest trading partner in the region. Although almost the entire relationship, 827 million out of the 849 billion in bilateral trade, was Mexican purchases of Russian products, Mexico's export to Russia also include a relatively large quantity of manufactured goods, and it continues with. Indeed, 55% of Mexican exports to Russia in 2013 were motorized vehicles, cars, trucks, motorcycles, etc. Although another 12% was alcohol and other beverages. For Russia, half of the nation's export to Mexico in 2013 were iron and steel, with another 21% being fertilizers and another 80% being mineral fuels and oils. Based on those, it's reasonable to see why Russia's military intelligence organization would want to know as much as possible on those nation-states and decisions before they were finalized, and that appears to be the main motivation behind the flood of cyber espionage operations that were executed around that time. Several private intelligence firms, as well as Western intelligence agencies from the European Union and the Five Eyes, have publicly stated that this multi-year activity, frequently dubbed as Operation Poundstorm, a codename originally given by Trend Micro Threat Research Team, was executed by Unit 26165 of the GRU. The GRU is a massive organization with tens of thousands of people working there. However, only a tiny part of it is responsible for cyber espionage operations. In particular, the Ministry of Defense is the parent entity of the GRU. GRU commands some special operations forces mainly related to covert action and special reconnaissance missions, but its core mission is military intelligence for all of the armed forces of Russia. So gathering any sort of intelligence that the armed forces need to succeed on their strategic, operational and tactical objectives. Within the GRU we find the 6th Directorate, which deals with electronic and signals intelligence. Naturally, this is where cyber operations fall as well as a subset of signals intelligence, and is where we find the Unit 26165. The official name of Unit 26165 was 85th Special Services Center, and its mission is to conduct computer network operations in order to collect intelligence. In simple terms, conduct cyber espionage. And with all of that context in mind, let's have a closer look at some of the operations. We will start with a Google-themed campaign. Operators of Unit 26165 of the GRU started with a very wide net with seemingly simplistic cyber operations, but we'll see that it was more advanced than it initially appeared. The initial engagement was done by sending fake suspicious login notifications like those ones to their targets. If anyone clicked on the check activity or reset password links, they were redirected to a GRU-operated website deceivingly named privacy.google-settings.com, which was asking the target to log in. Of course, if someone put their credentials there, the GRU operators would collect them. Here is an example of that. Before you start commenting on the simplicity of this cyber espionage operation, let us remind you of a GRU target that they used this credential harvesting tactic and kept having access to his emails from July 2015 and until August of 2016. Colin Powell. Other targets included journalists, politicians, military officials, defense contractors, intelligence professionals, and even large groups of people that were supporting a specific social group, ideology, or political party. And it wasn't always just credential harvesting campaigns. For instance, here you see another campaign executed around the same time by that GRU unit. Here, if a victim clicked on the Install Google Defender, they'd be redirected to a Google legitimate page like this one. Lots of people fell for this, but let's read it. Something that many don't do. It says that an account named Google Defender would like to view and manage your mail and view and manage the files in your Google Drive. Guess who had set up this Google Defender account and was sending out those requests? Apparently that GRU unit. That was a pretty clever technique actually, since someone needs to pay a lot of attention to notice this. So without spending more time into the Google-themed campaigns, here is a summary of some of the Google impersonating domains that they had used to execute similar operations. Feel free to pause the video if you want to study it further. Also, please note that this is not an exhaustive list. It's most of them though, so that gives you an idea of the amount of activity. And with that, let's see some of the more advanced cyber operations that the 85th Special Services Center of the GRU executed around that time, starting with the X-Agent. X-Agent is a code name for a software implant developed by the GRU, according to the US government, for cyber espionage infiltration operations. This software implant, or backdoor in simple terms, was first seen being used by the GRU in 2009, and it's still used at the time that this video is published. It basically provides full covert remote management of the infected system. This means that if you, sitting in front of your computer, can do a specific task, the same could be done covertly through a remote operator using the X-Agent. Of course, if they first manage to install it in your device. It has all the common capabilities like key logging, covert data exfiltration using a variety of methods, ability to evade several detections, and has been seen in at least those 5 versions: Windows, Mac, Linux, Apple iOS, and Android. As you can easily guess, in order to be able to do that for so long, it is constantly updated. Whether this is new capabilities or a new evasion technique, it's a constantly developed framework. Finally, we know a lot about it since lots of samples are publicly available. Those were published by different cybersecurity firms and researchers over the years so that more people can study them and understand them. Why this is important is because that was, naturally, part of some of the campaigns as well, and it was utilizing previously unknown flaws in popular software to propagate, something known as zero-day exploits. Here's how this process worked. They were sending some emails with some lure Microsoft Word document which in many cases had actual real sensitive information relevant to their targets. If the target clicked on this file, they wouldn't have to do anything else. Game over. GRU knew about some flaws in Microsoft Office that the rest of the world didn't and had developed some zero-day exploits to take advantage of them in those infiltration operations. For instance, one of them was later identified and fixed with a unique identifier CVE 2013-3906. In summary, that vulnerability was a design flaw on a Windows programming interface that was used to parse images. So by creating a specially crafted image in your document, you could trigger it and cause Windows to enter an unstable state. A skilled exploit developer could take advantage of that to inject code that will be executed, and using that, GRU was running some simple code, also covertly embedded in that Word document, a so-called dropper. It's called a dropper because its objective is to drop another file to the infected system and nothing more. This dropper was checking in with a GRU operator's command and control server to verify if it was indeed a real target and waiting for instructions on what to do next. If it was a real target system, then the command and control server would automatically send over a highly obfuscated and encrypted file. The dropper could then deobfuscate, decrypt, and run it, and that was another dropper. This second stage dropper was executing a series of detection evasion techniques and eventually dropping the final payload, the X-Agent implant that we already talked about. And from that point on, the X-Agent was receiving commands on what to do from GRU-operated command and control servers, which were usually deployed specifically for each target. That is, separate CNC servers for each infiltration target. At least 3 Microsoft zero-day exploits were used by the GRU during that period for such infiltration operations, and now that we covered some of the tactics, techniques and procedures, let's have a quick look at a couple of the targets of that era. In the introduction we talked about the warming up of relationships between Russia and Chile for the first time after decades, so here is what was also happening in the shadows at the same time. On January 12, 2014, the GRU Unit 26165 tested for less than 24 hours the target domain that you see here, which was impersonating the legitimate one that you also see on the bottom. Notice the subtle RNIL instead of MIL, which, depending on your font, it might not even be visible. That was the trick for that. This domain was the official webmail portal of the Air Force of Chile, and it was using a software called Zimbra. So all Air Force personnel from Chile would have accounts there to communicate. Here is now something that gives you also perspective on the operational planning of those cyber espionage operations. Although it was tested on January 12th, the campaign against the Chilean Air Force first launched on September 10th, literally 8 months after the initial test. Also, we can assume that prior to doing that test, the GRU officers would have to go through the typical intelligence bureaucracy with documenting the operation, objectives, budget and resource allocation, etc. So for an operation that lasted just 93 days, they had planned it at least 8 months in advance. Knowing that, meaning that GRU was able to plan it at least 8 months in advance, it was targeting the Air Force of Chile, and only for around 3 months, September to December of 2014, we can narrow down a lot what the potential intelligence requirements they were trying to fulfill were at that time. Please note that this is an assumption, since to this day it's not officially, publicly known what the actual requirement GRU had that led them to run this cyber espionage operation. In any case, we were able to find only 2 major events that could be known a year in advance and have significant value for a military intelligence organization. First, on September 19th, Chile was celebrating their 204th independence anniversary, and it was also the Day of the Armed Forces. That included a military parade, but most importantly, several visits from foreign officials for the celebrations, who also take advantage of that to discuss sensitive topics. That could clearly be one of the reasons, but an even more relevant one was the next one. Between 6 and 17 of October, the Air Force of Chile was organizing and hosting a joint Air Force military exercise with multiple nation states from the Latin America region. Something which could result in lots of useful knowledge exchange, classified evaluations, meetings and discussions about future cooperation and other potential valuable intelligence targets. But Chile wasn't the only target of those GRU operations. Let's talk about the government of Mexico, Russia's sixth largest trading partner in the region, and let's recall that 55% of Mexican exports were going to Russia at that point. This time, the impersonated domain was gob.mx, which was the official domain of the government of Mexico. Specifically, that was the email server as well as any other server from the government of Mexico. Notice that the GRU had registered a fake domain that had 0 instead of O. This was a more interesting case since that impersonating domain was used in two campaigns, one in 2013 and one in 2014, both around the same time, November to December. And just like the previous operation, the initial testing was performed 7.5 months prior to the launch of the infiltration campaigns. In this case, it was even harder finding out what happened every year around November, December, which could be of interest of the GRU. The only reasonable events we could identify were the discussions on energy developments as well as the annual budget reviews and approvals, both of which would be very valuable for Russia to know before they were finalized. And the last operation we will be covering in this lengthy episode is that of Boston Dynamics. Yes, the company with those robots that everyone has seen on internet videos. This time the 85th Special Services Center registered a lookalike domain and targeted Boston Dynamics' official email server, website, as well as other servers. The domain GRU registered was having L as in Lima instead of I as in India. Pretty hard to spot in an email. This was tested for less than 48 hours on April 24, 2014, and the operation actually launched on November 4th, so 6.5 months after the initial test. This operation lasted for 132 days, November of 2014 to March of 2015, and we assume that this was a clear case of economic espionage for classified military technologies. The reason is that in December of 2013, Boston Dynamics passed the DARPA's Robotic Challenge or DRC to develop some special purpose military robots. They even received a $10 million investment from DARPA for the development of that robot. And later on, Boston Dynamics announced they were having several advancements in their military robot for June 2015 finals. So although there are no hard evidence to confirm this hypothesis, it's reasonable to think that GRU would be interested in obtaining access to this military research project. And that concludes our part 1 of breaking down some of the cyber espionage operations executed in 2014-2016 by Russia's military intelligence, the GRU. The cyberspace provides deniability beyond the other domains, and most importantly, it significantly reduces the operational security risks. A spy can no longer be executed in a foreign country simply because they'll never have to step on it to collect the information they were tasked to gather. Obviously, human intelligence is still crucial, like any other intelligence discipline, but this summary gives a good overview of modern espionage history and how it changes the landscape. We covered wide targeting operations, like those Google-themed ones, some of the cyber espionage tools of the GRU like the X-Agent, and even a series of highly targeted military intelligence cyber operations against Chile, Mexico, and even a private company, Boston Dynamics. And that is barely scratching the tip of the iceberg. The spy versus spy game on the cyber front is a modern form of the Cold War, and those cyber operations give us a glimpse into the shadow war for information that could take a nation-state's military one step ahead of their enemies. Google sites that aren't Google, zero-day exploits, tailored software implants remaining hidden, data getting covertly exfiltrated from military and government networks. Nothing is as it seems.